Hello, my name is Tariro Masayiti. I'm the winemaker at Springfontein Wine Estate. It's really great pleasure to talk to you about our single vineyard Chenin Blanc, Jils Dune. I'll be talking briefly about the terroir that we have at Springfontein, as well as a little bit information about our 2014, 2015 and 2016 vintage. We've just won an amazing award, a trophy, for the best wine in a competition with our single vineyard Jils Dune Chenin Blanc 2016. And because of this, I think it's worth celebrating, and what a better way than to also share in tasting some of the different vintages that we've had. And I know some of you are going to be tasting 2014, 2015, 2016 vintage of this wine. Just to start off with, Springfontein is in an area in the Overberg or the Walker Bay region of South Africa, and we are in a much smaller ward which is called Springfontein Rim, and this rim is demarcated with limestone soils. So we have a region which is completely under limestone, and this is very unique in South Africa because there's not a single vineyard as it is today, or a single farm growing vines which is completely under limestone, except Springfontein. So this is very, very unique. We also have very close by the Atlantic Ocean, which is much cooler air and cooler winds, which helps to cool down the microclimate. So it helps with the ripening of the grapes and the development of the grapes throughout the year. We also have got very high mountain range, Klein River Mountains just close by, and this also influences very much the microclimate at Springfontein. So for a very small area, we are very blessed with something that is so natural, and obviously helps quite a lot with growing of our grapes and eventually the wines that we put in the bottle. So 2014 vintage, what was special about 2014? Some of you, if you are familiar with the weather pattern in South Africa, in the Western Cape especially, we had big rains in 2013. We even had floods in the area, floods in 2013. And then 2014, the very dry winter. I would say the drought spell actually started in 2014. Very, very dry weather. We had very low yield in 2014. Probably one of the lowest yields we have had. Conditions in spring leading to flowering of the vines in 2014. Lots of wind. We also had some bit of botrytis, downy mildew, downy mildew during flowering, and this resulted in very low yields, so we would have lost some fruit during flowering, and the end result was very, very small crop. With small crop always comes the advantage of quite intense fruit, berries, which much smaller berries. The fruit in 2014 was really fantastic. We harvested grapes by hand. We're harvesting all the grapes by hand. They stay overnight in a cold room on the farm, and the following day we are sorting the bunches, and we do whole bunch pressing for this wine. I'm doing whole bunch pressing, and then settling the juice over 2 days, and then fermenting in French oak barrels. I used in 2014 50% new oak, and the other 50% was used barrels. The oak element in Chenin Blanc, it's always attracting quite a lot of discussions and some very much discussions centering around, is oak important? Should we use oak? Is it better with less oak, and so forth? I think it depends on the ripeness levels of your grapes. It depends on the style of wine you're making, and as long as the wine is in balance with the oak, I don't see any problem with it. I think it's if anything, it actually adds very much to complexity. The oak should never take away from the expression of the grape and the expression of the terroir, and in my case, this is really something I thrive to achieve, that there's a huge expression of the terroir and a huge expression of the variety in the wines. Fermentation of all the wines in all the 3 vintages was with the indigenous yeast. Now, indigenous yeast can be different depending where you are. In our case, in the Western Cape especially, we've got a very special indigenous vegetation called fynbos. This is made up of different species of plants, and most of them quite herbaceous. Most of them very interesting natural aromas that they give. And we have yeast that actually grows within this fynbos vegetation. And we allow a lot of this fynbos to grow in between our vines. And as a result, you can also imagine that when we speak about indigenous yeast, the indigenous yeast is not only influenced by the type of variety growing, but it's also by the type of, it's not influenced only by the type of grape variety growing, but by the type of indigenous vegetation growing. And our alkaline soils have got very special indigenous fynbos. So for me, I always try to really bring some of this character of this indigenous vegetation into the wines by fermenting natural. The wines go through malolactic fermentation in the barrel. After yeast fermentation, I go through malolactic fermentation and some batonnage just to allow for the development of the wine on the lees. And then I test the wines throughout the year. Once I'm ready, I think the wines are ready to bottle, I bottle, and they go into the bottle for quite a few months. In fact, more than 16 months before the wines are released. So aging is very important in the bottle before the wines are released. Move over to 2015 vintage. The drought continued in 2015. So by then, we obviously had to be adjusting our vineyard practices so that we try to have balance in the vineyards in terms of the crop that we are harvesting. 2015 was one of the most, how can I say, it's one of the most beautiful vintages in South Africa, I think. As much as we are in a cooler area, 2015 overall was much cooler than 2014. Much longer ripening season. I would say an interesting integration of aromas, interesting balance between sugars and acids during ripening, during harvesting rather. As for the winemaking, I pretty much followed the same concept of harvesting grapes where I'm looking for yellow fruit. For Jils Dune, for me, this is very important. This particular block is ripening with grapes where if you harvest earlier, you have got quite a lot of fresh aromatics, fresh fruit with good acidity. And if you allow the grapes to ripen a little bit longer, you have a combination. I would say 60-70% of the fruit is yellow with yellow fruits, and about 20-30% is still fresh fruit, and the combination of this for me is always interesting. 2015, very rewarding vintage again overall on all the different varieties, but for Jils Dune, also outstanding vintage. Fermented again in French oak, a bit of Hungarian oak I've used in 2015, and I've used again 50% new and 50% used barrels. Went through malolactic fermentation in barrel, and after bottling the wine also matured at minimum 16 months before release. And then 2016 coincides in 2016 with our registration of the farm to be certified organic. In the past, we've always been working natural, organic, but we were never certified. We never took the decision to certify the farm. And in 2016 was the first vintage that we were certified. In fact, we were registered for organic growing and organic winemaking. So we were not certified yet, but we were registered for organic growing, and we had to go through 3-year period of conversion to organic. and 2019 would be the first vintage that we are certified organic. So 2016, rolling back to 2016, we paid a lot of attention in the vineyards to really think differently in the sense of, in the work of a drought, how again do you bring balance? We did quite a lot of things. I mean, it's not myself doing all this work. We've got a team of guys and ladies helping us, and all of us, I would say we were much better in our thinking and our approach to farming with vineyards in a drought condition or under drought conditions. With the harvesting, 2016, we started the harvesting. We looked at bringing some fruit a little bit earlier, and we did a second harvest and a third harvest out of the same block, this single vineyard block. The block is about 1.14 hectares, so it's relatively, it's not too big, it's not too small, and planted 20 years ago, so it's quite old, and requires quite a lot of work, because a 20-year-old vineyard, you find different vines literally developing differently. It's not a uniform block. You have to pay attention to each individual block, individual vine. And by then, I would say we really tried to bring in fruit at different levels of ripeness by being specific, identifying certain bunches. And in 2016, I also started fermenting wine with egg-shaped fermenters. We brought some very special tanks from Germany, from spiral tanks. And these tanks, the shape of this tank is an egg, and this also allowed for very interesting fermentation with indigenous yeast, where you have got very interesting movement of yeast during fermentation, whereas in a barrel, it's also just as good, but this was different. So I fermented a portion of this Jils Dune Chenin in 2016 in the egg fermenters, and then later on moved the wine to barrel for malolactic fermentation. A portion of the wine was already from the beginning put into barrel for fermentation with indigenous yeast again. In total, I've used 40% new oak in 2016, and very interesting expression of Chenin Blanc, in that as we use indigenous yeast, we're not necessarily having an overwhelming expression of esters that most people would get if they use commercial yeast, which is meant to produce this kind of aromas. We've got a lot of minerality in the wines, quite rich tropical fruits, mostly pineapple aromas. You also get a good expression, I would say, of the fine-boss that we find in the vineyards. I think I get it in the wine, and the expression, the vanilla notes and so forth that comes out of the oak, making the wine really stand out. But what's very special about the 2016 vintage is that it's very rich and opulent. It's not rich and too overpowering, but it's rich and opulent. And I think for a wine like this, I thought maybe I share a glass here. I put my bottle hidden at the back. You look at the color here. It's this is the 2016. So this is the Jils Dune, the single vineyard Jils Dune Chenin Blanc 2016. Very, very lovely color, dark, nearly going to slight yellow, straw yellow, coming from the richness, obviously, of the ripeness of the fruit, as well as the 40% use of the oak. Wow, this is always beautiful to smell this wine. You almost don't want to taste it, you just want to smell it. It's really, really lovely. It's always amazing when you have a wine that's so complex. When you taste it, it's so rich, and then finishes off with freshness from the minerality of the limestone soils. And I hope if you have a chance to taste this wine, you can also experience a bit of what we are bottling and making here in Stanford at Springfontein Wine Estate. Cheers.